Okay, so this morning's reading we're going to read the whole of Matthew 7 with an emphasis on the verses on the screen, purely for the fact that by the time we look it all up, we may as well read the whole thing. But Jonah has asked that those verses particularly you could pay attention to, and Brother Matt's going to come forward and do that. Thank you, Matt.
As we come to remember Jesus this morning, I want to explore this teaching of Jesus, this parable in Matthew 7, parable of the wise and foolish builders, and its important message to us around this idea of being solidified in Jesus' teachings and morals in our walk of faith, and particularly in the days we live in. So that's the theme, stability in an unstable world. And last week I had no idea I was doing an exhort, because I don't read the program, or haven't read the program in a while, but thanks to Jem, I got a week's notice. But it got me thinking, what am I going to speak on this week? Because when Jem let me know, I didn't have anything that I'd been thinking about that I necessarily wanted to talk about, or something that came to mind straight away. But what I often find is that if you leave something and let it mull over, something occasionally comes to you even subconsciously. So that was just ticking in the back of my mind this week. And I'm not really much of a news person. In fact, I generally hate watching like negative news or reading the news. But I guess the semi-regular news source I would go through is X, which is formerly Twitter. But yeah, literally between last Sunday, when I got notified I was exhorting today, and Monday and Tuesday, I reckon I scrolled through like half a dozen significant world events all over X. And it kind of struck me just more than normal. I was like, man, this world is really just completely turbulent at the moment. It's on edge and unstable. There seems to be significant events happening every day in every country, which got me thinking about this parable of Jesus and this comparison between the house built on rock versus the house built on sand, and how they stand up and compare against being smashed by waves, which you could say is an instability in trials and tests. So let me read a few things just over the last months, weeks, up to as recent as this week. You're probably all aware of the assassination attempt on former President Trump. That was very significant. Recently, the killing of one of Hamas's leader. The title is "Killing of Hamas Chief in Iran Stirs Fears of Retaliation." Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated in the Iranian capital, Tehran, early on Wednesday morning. An attack that drew threats of revenge on Israel and fueled further concern that the conflict in Gaza was turning into a wider Middle Eastern war. This week, quote, Iran says it has duty to punish Israel over killing of Hamas leader in Tehran. And there's news that allegedly Russia is sending weapons to Iran and troops. Earlier this week on Monday, we had the stock market crash. 6.4 trillion stock wipeout has traders fearing great unwind is just starting. Also, one of more than 10% in worst losses since 1987. You may have seen on the news the civil unrest in the UK and in Europe. Protests, fighting, violence. You might have seen Elon's response to some of these videos coming out of the UK. He says, civil war is inevitable. So whatever you think of that, regardless, there's stuff going on over there. And we have escalations in Israel and Gaza and Russia and Ukraine. So there's all these things happening at the moment. Now, perhaps you might think there's a case to dismiss this all as, these are just recent things. We've got a recency bias. Things like this have been happening for a long time, and we're just geared towards the next thing that hits us in the face, and we'll forget about them until the next thing comes along. It's not a big deal. Here's a thought experiment. You might remember Mark Glacken did a talk recently, and one of the things he touched on was our day being the day of the Son of Man, likened to the days of Lot and Noah. Quote, "Just as it was in the days of Noah, so also will it be in the days of the Son of Man." People were eating, drinking, marrying, and being given in marriage up to the day Noah entered the ark. Then the flood came and destroyed them all. That's from Luke 17. And I want to highlight another critical quote regarding the times of Noah. The Lord saw, this is from Genesis 6:5. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. So the thought experiment is this: what kind of world do you get when you combine a wicked human race where their every thought is evil all the time? So are the events that we see, are they just once-offs and we can pass over them, or do you feel like things may be escalating on a global scale? Now, of course, my intention isn't to make this beautiful parable in Matthew 7 into some sort of weird events, current events, doom and gloom. I don't think that's an appropriate way to introduce our remembrance of Jesus and worship of him. I hope to show that actually the message of Matthew 7 is one of complete encouragement and hope. And the focal point of Jesus' parable here, and the message this morning, being the key encouragement and command in verse 24. Who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. Now, these words that he's referring to, of course, is in the context of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, covering all sorts of practical godly direction to the believer. So one of the things I thought of when considering Matthew 7 was that it really is this battle between instability against the house. We have the rain coming down, the streams rising, the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. And so we're represented as either the wise man or the foolish man building the house. Which house? Well, we choose. The trials, the hard times, the forging, the tests of daily life, all represented in this parable as turmoil and instability with these harsh winds, lots of rain and flooding. I guess there are two key things that stood out to me, and letting it just mull over this week and reflecting on it. One, which character has not been tested or had significant instability? Which character in the Bible has not been tested, had significant instability in their life, or gone through these radically life-changing experiences? Which character in the Bible didn't have a house that was battered against through trials, tribulations, and experiences, and either they withstood those challenges through faith and godliness, or whose house was destroyed by unfaithfulness? And every character that jumped into my mind on the positive front, Noah, Moses, Joshua, Esther, David, Solomon, Joseph, Job, Mary, Jesus, all of these characters had these things happen to them. The second thing I thought of is we might be living in unique times, but Jesus' parable regarding the choice between us becoming the wise builder or the foolish builder is timeless. Whether it be today's challenges or the challenges that were faced throughout history, the message is exactly the same. Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. So with those ideas in mind, I want to look at 3 examples this morning: Abraham, Joseph, and Jesus. Let's explore how each of these characters anchored themselves in faith and stability in God through the instability of their trials and suffering. Let's have a look at Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 5. This is our first introduction we have of God speaking directly to Abram. Starting at verse 1. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I'll make you into a great nation, and I'll bless you. I'll make your name great, and you'll be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I'll curse. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. So the key verses here being, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I'll make you into a great nation. So he's really called to just pack up and head to a land that God will show him. Get on the road, pack up your stuff, and what's particularly interesting is God says, I'll make you into a great nation. But literally just a few verses ago in chapter 11, in verse 29, reading Terah's family line, now Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive. So literally on the first few pages of us being introduced to Abram, we have this expression of his obedience and trust in God and his guidance. And there's no doubt he's literally just been thrown into this limited information adventure, almost like a more details to come planning session, and told he'll become a great nation. So this is the start and introduction to Abram's journey of faith and trust in God and his ways. And this initial example expresses the ideas we are discussing in the parable of the wise and foolish builder, where he trusts God's words and does them. He's anchored in stability and trust in God, and you could say that this is the start of Abraham's building career. He's building himself on God's rock. Once upon a time, a couple of years back, Laura and I left our families and our hometown to explore places that were unknown. Of course, this was of our own accord. This was a time when we had built a bus home and we travelled around a bit and ended up living in the bus for about 8 months, the majority of 2021. This example of Abram got me thinking about this, because while it was fun and a very positive time in our life and a great memory we'll always hold on to, once we moved into the little rental in Kurumbong, that quickly became solid grounding, a home. It was nice to have a place to store everything, space, appliances, toilet and shower you didn't have to go outside to go to. So perhaps this command to uproot Abram's home and family was quite the unstable calling. Echoing the text in Matthew 7, the rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. And as we are well aware, we may generate instability and difficulties ourselves, but they can also come from God as tests of our character in order to bring us to a deeper understanding, faith, and trust in Him. And that's what we see in this example. With trust and faith, Abram took the initial swing hammer and started the good work of building a solid foundation in God. Let's turn to our second consideration in Genesis 37 and look at Joseph. Starting around verse 12. Now, I'm not going to read all of it, but the section is verse 12 to 36. So he sent off to his brothers in verse 14, go and see if all is well with your brothers and bring word back to me. Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. So he goes on this journey and he's looking for his brothers. He finds someone in the field. Hey, I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they're grazing their flocks? And then as he comes to his brothers later on, here comes that dreamer. They said to each other, come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. And they have this little interaction. But then in verse 23 we see, so when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty, there was no water in it. Then as the story goes, we know how it ends for Joseph being sold into slavery. So this really is one of the turning points in Joseph's life. The start to Joseph's journey, and quite fitting to our parable in consideration this morning. Literally thrown into a pit, thrown into darkness, thrown into chaos and instability. And this is a significant unstable life event likened to the winds, the rain and the flooding in Matthew 7. What type of feeling would you feel if your family threw you into a pit and sold you? How would I feel? The people I love, the people I know better than most, who support me, who I grew up with. However, regardless of Joseph's unstable setting, having just been rejected and turned against by his own family, he no doubt would have been holding dearly to those dreams about him being elevated that were given to him. And these dreams obviously meant something to Joseph, enough to share with his family. And we see examples of his faith and stability in these dreams and the promise and in God that shine through the difficult trials ahead. So one example of Joseph being anchored in God's ways and built on solid foundation is the example we have in Genesis 39 with Potiphar's wife. I'm just going to read a key quote from there, but essentially Potiphar propositions Joseph and he responds. He refused. With me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? So this is just one example of many that beautifully contrast the parable of Jesus. Joseph, like Abraham, like us, are faced with instability and difficulties. The waves, wind, the batterings of life. But our and their response to this is expressed through actions and words. Abraham listened to God. Similar to Matthew 7, Jesus again says, whoever hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house. And with Joseph, we have the practical outworking of listening and doing, putting into practice. He paid attention to his dreams, and he was grounded in godly principles, which was reflected in his response to his unstable circumstances. Now, what I find particularly special about these examples and stories is that the finale is salvation. The conclusion of the story is saving, which of course is what this morning is all about, remembering the salvation brought about by Jesus extended to us. With the example of Abraham, God made a covenant with Abraham, promising that he would become the father of many nations and that through his offspring, all nations on earth would be blessed. This promise is foundational for the coming of Jesus, who was a descendant of Abraham. And Joseph, we have the preservation of his family line through severe famine. Reading from Genesis 45, verses 7 and 8. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler of all Egypt. Now, in conclusion to this parable, I want to consider the example of Jesus if we want to turn to John 13. Section about Jesus washing his disciples' feet, starting at verse 1. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for his time to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing and wrapped a towel around his waist. And after that he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. And the key verses being 1 to 5, but also later on in 12, when he finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I have done for you? In verse 15, I've set you an example that you should do as I have done. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. So perhaps the most beautiful expression of this concept that we're considering in this parable in Matthew 7, the man that's anchored in Jesus, anchored in God's ways, which Jesus was through and through, he's the man that remains strong through the severe weathers of life. This really was the pinnacle of Jesus' suffering right before his death, and of course we've read time and time again the mental and physical state he was in, especially reading on in the garden. This certainly was one of those times of significant instability for Jesus. His friend and disciple had betrayed him. Later on we read his other friends run away. Peter denies him, and ultimately he's about to die. Yet, what a picture-perfect example Jesus gives us that sums up this principle of having stability in an unstable world. He decides to use his final moments in complete selfless love to wash his disciples' feet, serve them and teach them. He remains steadfast even in the face of ultimate instability. Let us remember how our world today reflects that same turbulence in different form. The events that we've considered this morning, unrest, violence, uncertainty, are all reminders of the instability that surrounds us. Yet, just as Jesus stood firm, anchored in God's will, so too can we find stability in his teachings. And as the world continues to shake, let us not forget the house built on the rock, which stands firm through every storm. This is the hope and encouragement we carry with us. In the midst of our instability, our foundation in Christ will never falter. So what an example, inspiration and conclusion to this parable and principle that he's given us in Matthew 7. And with that practical, selfless love he expressed to his disciples in the upper room, brings even more power to the words he says in Matthew 7. Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock.